Hello and welcome. Our selection today is Flight of Fire. It is the story of Victoria, a woman who will stop at nothing to gain freedom for her unborn child. If you like the story, we invite you to subscribe to this channel and return for more stories. It was early evening, nearing dusk at the Schuyler farm near the piney woods of East Texas. The owner of the farm, Foster Schuyler, had been gone nearly 3 months, riding south to Houston with 2 of his hands, a few slaves he intended to sell, and a wagon load of cotton. Schuyler was a small man, standing not much taller than 5'6". If he weighed 125, he would be lucky. He was far too small for battle, but it did not matter. He had gotten an exemption from the Confederate draft because he held more than 30 blacks in bondage. The war was in its infancy, and the Confederates were not desperate enough to draft very old men, very young men, or the feeble. Schuyler tried desperately to garner respect from anyone he met. Few people responded in the manner he desired. The slaves called him master to his face. Behind his back, they simply called him Lil Schuyler. Most people knew his father, who was called Big Schuyler. He was a massive figure of a man, which made folks wonder who the daddy of Lil Schuyler was. During the 3 months Lil Schuyler was gone, his crew languished at night in the bunkhouse. On most nights, they drank themselves stupid and passed out while the lanterns flickered out. The overseer, an older man named Simpson, kept to himself. He was left in charge, but he was too old or too lazy to walk the field rows. This was the first time Lil Schuyler had hired white hands to help Simpson. However, they were deserters and they came cheaply. Victoria, a 17-year-old female slave with skin the color of late summer acorns, looked around the slave quarters. It was unusually quiet. The field gang had stopped work earlier than usual, and they sought time alone with family or sought desperately needed rest. Victoria rarely encountered silence on the farm. This one was wide and thick like clouds on an overcast day. Victoria stood at the edge of the slave quarters, a basket of wet clothes balanced on her hip. Her fingers ached from wringing out the shirts. She had been trained as seamstress, but since the first wife, Emmeline Schuyler, died, Victoria had no work. The second wife, Mary, brought her own dresses. She claimed they were French, but Victoria knew they were locally made in Louisiana. She saw them up close while she was hanging up Schuyler's shirts. Dressmaking was a skill Victoria had learned from her grandmother, Charlotte, who had fashioned the elegant dresses worn by the wife of Old Man Schuyler, who was Foster's grandfather. She chose to end her life rather than to watch her husband go to Charlotte's blue cabin. When his son, Big Schuyler, took over the farm, he put Charlotte back in the quarters and placed her daughter, Lizzie, in the blue cabin. Lizzie was Victoria's mother. Big Schuyler also made nightly forays to the blue cabin on the end of the slave quarters. It stood out because it was painted, unlike the other cabins, which were little more than logs stacked together. The blue cabin had a window with a wooden shutter and a small smokestack. It was not much, but compared to the rest of the cabins, it was very fine. The sky had turned a dull ochre, with low clouds that whispered thunder without ever speaking. A faint rustle in the woods caught her ear. It was not an animal nor a bird. Victoria didn't turn her head. She didn't flinch. She just walked steady, like she was headed to the creek to rinse the last pair of breeches. Behind the tall grass, past the edge of the cotton rows, a tall dark man stood staring at her. Tower loved to watch her. She was graceful, beautiful, and book-learned, another skill passed down by her grandmother, who learned as she performed the duties of nursemaid to Lil Schuyler's sister, May Ann. When Victoria's mother, Lizzie, died in childbirth, she was left in the care of her grandmother. She saw to most of Victoria's needs, but she could not protect her from the fate that had befallen her or her daughter. The women, Charlotte, her daughter, Lizzie, and now her granddaughter, Victoria, were all inhabitants of the cabin at the end of the slave quarters. Although they would be considered slave mistress in the eyes of the whites who worked on the farm, the women had no choice in the matter. They were all raised to serve the will of the slave master. Foster Schuyler ordered Victoria to be placed in the blue cabin on the night her mother died. With the aid of her grandmother, Charlotte, the healer and midwife, Victoria had avoided the misfortune of bearing the child of Lil Schuyler. The children of slave masters were often sold away due to the pleas of wives who did not want to see the faces of their husbands' enslaved children. Nearly 3 months earlier, Victoria's husband Tower was sent to the backfields to break new ground. Somehow, Lil Skylar had learned of their marriage. Tower was tied up at night, and he slept in a cabin with other male field hands. Although Tower and Victoria had exchanged vows, Skylar did not allow Tower near his wife. Tower was too black, too strong, too big, and too defiant. In all honesty, Lil Skylar was terrified of the slave, which is why he took special delight in taking Victoria as a concubine. Like Tower, Lil Skylar knew Victoria was the best female for miles. She was tall, bodacious, and lovely. Very few women possessed such a figure. Shortly after being sent to the backfields, Tower disappeared. Rumors said he tried to fight a white man and was whipped nearly to death. Others said he simply ran away. In truth, Tower had challenged Lil Skylar over his wife. The consequences were dire. People searched high and low for the Tower of a man who threatened to kill the slave master for coming near his wife. But here he was, tall and black as chiseled obsidian. His face thin with a jaw like iron. The long scar across his forearm was crusted over with a scab. Victoria, he said low, like her name was something he hadn't earned the right to say yet. Her knees gave way before she could speak. She placed the basket on the ground and ran to him. He caught her with one arm, the other too stiff to move quickly. Tower's breath was hot and rough against her neck. They didn't speak. There was nothing safe in words. Not yet. Behind the old cotton gin, beneath a canvas tarp someone forgot years ago, they made a place for themselves. Victoria peeled his shirt from his shoulders, saw the welts from lashes, raised like vines across his back. He looked at her belly slightly round. Victoria saw the flash in his eyes. It was a question. A storm brewing. Victoria's voice trembled, but it came honestly. He has been comin' to me at night. My Grammy see to it that his seed don't catch. He nodded in acknowledgement, but Tower didn't move. His fists curled slow, like the earth itself was clenching under him. I don't call for him, she whispered. He touched her face with fingers like tree roots. I know, Victoria. His deep baritone voice cracked as he strained to hide his dismay. This was the reason he had to leave. Tower and Victoria had been married secretly by the itinerant preacher who preached about the righteousness of slavery to the slave. Tower had no use for such lies, most slaves didn't, but it gave them a much-needed day of rest. Tower had used half the money he earned when hired out to pay the preacher. It made Victoria happy and Victoria made Tower happy. It was the only joy he had in his 25 years on the planet. She was the best woman around for miles. Tower could not protect his wife, who he loved fiercely. He couldn't bear to allow Skylar to be with her. He had challenged Skylar, threatened to kill him. Lil Skylar knew it was inevitable. So, Foster had Tower bound at gunpoint by the hands and sold away to Louisiana, but he broke free. He dispatched the slave trader and made his way back to his wife. Heat surged inside of Tower's belly. It was the kind of heat that grew from the intense anger of a man who could not protect that which was his. He should have seen it coming, but he couldn't help but love this woman. As a child, Victoria was dressed better than the rest of the children. She wore cast-off dresses of May and Foster's sister. Her curly hair was adorned with trinkets from the women of the household. Victoria was her mother's daughter, and Lil Skylar wanted her to fill the role that old man Skylar had exacted from her grandmother and Big Skylar from her mother. Each generation of slave mistress growing a shade lighter by degrees. Tower reached over and touched her honey-colored skin. It was soft as satin, and she smelled clean, not like most slaves in the quarter who toiled into the evening with little time for bathing except on Sunday, for church service. Doing laundry gave Victoria access to water and soap, and she used it freely. Victoria kissed Tower then, her desperate, dry lips aching, and the earth around them seemed to fall away. There was no freedom in it. No solace. Just need. Just the hunger of two souls kept apart for too long. It had been nearly 3 months since they had been together. By the time they lay still, the sun had dipped behind the pines and the whippoorwills had started their song. Victoria traced her fingers over Tower's chest, breathing in the smell of sweat, blood, and dust. "I can't stay long," he said. "If they catch me here, they will hang me slow." She nodded, jaw tight. "Then we wait to leave, but this time, we are going together." Tower didn't answer, but he held her hand and didn't let go until the stars were sharp above them and the woods had grown quiet again. Clara moved through the house like smoke. She'd learned to smile without showing teeth, to bow her head low, and to stay close to the shadows, but tonight, she wanted to be seen by Skylar. Foster Skylar had returned after midnight, the wheels of his carriage groaning over the dirt drive. Victoria had barely made it back to her cabin, her skin still smelling of Tower sweat. Her body ached in a way that made her feel alive and frightened at once. She'd curled up on her pallet, staring at the ceiling, praying her body wouldn't betray her with the slow changes already beginning to affect her body. Clara saw Victoria slip back into her cabin. She'd seen Tower go back into the woods too. She didn't feel rage at first, just the cold pinch of loss. Tower used to call Clara Honey Bee back before Lil Foster split the field workers from the housefolk. Back when they were allowed to breathe the same dust. But now Tower barely looked at her. And then there was Victoria. Clara believed Victoria always thought she was better than the rest of the other slaves. She was smarter, sharper, and prettier. Even in the fields as a young teen when her back was bent and her hands were raw, Victoria walked like someone waiting for freedom to show up at her door. Clara knew better. Freedom would not come. You had to carve it out with your tongue or your silence, or both. So, as Lil Skylar downed his third glass of whiskey, Clara stood just outside the dining room archway and cleared her throat. He turned, his eyes slow to focus. "What?" he snapped. She didn't lift her head fully to meet his eyes. "Beggin' your pardon, sir. I saw something you should know." His eyes narrowed. "Speak." Clara swallowed hard. Then she whispered, "The one called Victoria. She been with the big one you sent to the backfields. The one named Tower." He stared at her, dead silent. "She probably with child now. No way to tell, could be yours. But she sneak off, to him. Early this night." Skylar set his glass down slow. The clink of crystal on the wood surface sounded louder than thunder. "She carry in a baby, you say?" "Yes, sir." Clara dared to glance up. "The other slaves think too much of her. It might be safer if she's sold off." "If it please you," she said, stirring the pot. The master leaned back in his chair, rubbing his stubble with thin fingers. A child, even a slave child, was better than none. His first wife, Emmy, never had a live birth. Charlotte attended each one. Each child was stillborn. The last one took her with it. A cruel calm settled over his face. Clara knew that look. It was the look of someone deciding not whether to kill a dog, but when. "Go on," he said. "Get Simpson. Tell him to wake the hands." Less than an hour later, the door to Victoria's cabin burst open like a gunshot. She sat up on her pallet, her heartbeat racing. Two white men stood in the doorway, Simpson the overseer and a tall, lanky hand. Behind them loomed Lil Skylar, his face unreadable but his eyes blazing. "Come out," Skylar growled. Victoria stood barefoot and afraid, but trying not to shake. "What's this about, sir? You been with Tower?" His voice cracked like a whip. She said nothing. He took a step inside. "Answer me." "No," she whispered, but he could see in her eyes it was a lie. Tower and Victoria were desperately in love. That was enough to set him off. Skylar lunged forward, backhanded Victoria so hard she stumbled against the wall, hitting her head. Her lips split. Her ears rang. "Get her up," he ordered. The men grabbed her by the arms and dragged her outside. The moonlight lit the yard in cool silver. Clara stood in the shadows of the porch of the main house, not daring to be seen. Charlotte stood by the kitchen door of the big house. She had a clear view of Clara and the quarters. Lil Skylar's wife may have carried the title of mistress, but Charlotte ran the household. There was nothing she did not see. Nothing she did not hear. That night, she knew that Clara had betrayed Victoria, violating the code upheld by all enslaved blacks. She sold out another slave to improve her lot. Victoria was on her knees in the dirt now, Skylar looming over her. "You carry in my child," he spat. She raised her head, blood at the corner of her mouth. "No, I carry Tower's child," she said defiantly. He was her husband in the eyes of God. Skylar kicked her in the side. The pain bloomed a bright white behind her eyes. She gasped, but didn't cry out. "I'll have you sold," he hissed. "You'll be gone by sunrise." Tower watched from the trees, fists clenched so hard he thought his bones would crack. His gut was filled with fire. His heart screamed to run down, to fight, to take her and flee. But 2 rifles were pointed at Victoria. She could be hurt or even killed in the fray. The master was clever, but Tower had outsmarted the small man on more than one occasion. There was a dead slave trader buried near a creek outside Bossier City. His wagon submerged. The skittish horse set free. Tower didn't move, not yet. But something inside him did. He would not let Victoria be sold. Skylar had left Victoria crumpled on the ground in front of her cabin. A few slaves peeked out after the commotion ended. Her ribs still ached from the boot that struck her side. For the next few minutes, Victoria lay on the porch. She saw the flicker of flame in the big house. She finally made her way slowly inside the blue cabin, but it was no refuge from the anger that was forthcoming. Lil Foster didn't want Victoria dead. He just wanted to rid her of the evidence of her betrayal. He would have another child, but there were doubts about the sire of this one. He knew wife showed no signs of fertility. He could not have known that Charlotte brewed a specialty for Mary, as she did for the first wife, Emmeline. The Schuyler line would end with Foster Schuyler. She could not stop him from taking her granddaughter. The fates of the 2 families were perversely joined, but there would not be another Schuyler. Not for Foster's wife, or for his sister, May, and Charlotte had seen to that. Her teas, cordials, and cakes were in big demand around the holidays. All contained a blend of herbs that cut the Schuyler line surely, as if Charlotte yielded a blade to do so. Foster was coming back. Victoria heard his boots long before she saw him. His steps didn't rush. They were measured, like a man convinced of his right to walk the world as he pleased. Victoria's blue cabin stood apart from the rest. It was built from better wood. It was the only slave cabin with a proper wooden floor. It had been sanded smooth, and she scrubbed it every Sunday. The small potbelly cook stove was aged with rust now, but it still burned warm with pine pitch and bark scraps. It had been a gift or a trophy, depending on who told the story. Some said that old man Schuyler had it hauled up from New Orleans for her grandmother, Charlotte. Others said it was salvaged from a burned-out house. Along the wall, delicate dresses hung like ghosts. There were silks and satins that once belonged to Lil Schuyler's first wife, Emmeline. He dressed Victoria in them sometimes. Made her wear gloves to serve him whiskey. Called her Emmeline like she was someone else. Victoria was standing by the stove, clutching her belly, when Schuyler entered without knocking. "I treated you good," he said, voice thick with something foul. "Better than most coloreds, and this how you repay me?" His eyes scanned the room like it belonged to him. And in the eyes of the law it did. Every log, every brick, every breath exhaled from every soul on the farm belonged to him, including his new young wife who brought with marriage a connection to a family of influence. Victoria didn't speak. She didn't move. He came closer, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the fury of wounded pride. "You think you can carry a black child under my roof?" It was a preposterous statement. Any child of Victoria would be black. As much as he pretended, Victoria was not Emmeline. She was a black woman and a slave. Victoria looked away, thinking it might soften him. Instead, it spurred him on. He swung his fist hard, striking the left side of her face. He wanted to beat a sense of loyalty and submission into her. She would do all that he required of her, any time, any place. Victoria cried out, and that cry, half smothered, rose into the night. Tower heard the cry of his wife. He hadn't gone back to the woods. He stood just beyond the light that sipped through the cracks in her old shutter. His fists clenched, muscles pulsing with adrenaline. When Tower heard his wife, a sound he knew like his own breath, he moved back toward the cabin. One kick had shattered the door jamb. Wood splintered. The door slammed open. Ash from the stove flared in response to the draft. Schuyler turned startled by the sound. He had no time to react. His hands were still clutching the rope that hung from Victoria's neck. Tower crossed the floor in 2 steps. He seized Skylar by the neck and tossed him like a bag of feed. Little Skylar stared back at Tower. His eyes bulged. The look on his face was greater than fear. His face revealed recognition that his time on Earth was short. Tower lifted Skylar off his feet by his neck and threw him against the far wall. He slumped to the floor, dazed. The fancy dresses fell in a heap on top of him. One of the frocks, light pink with a lace collar, rested on Skylar's face after his head struck the wall. Red liquid began to bloom through the lace from the gash in his face. The lace turned pink, matching the color of the dress, then it turned red. Victoria was frozen, wide-eyed, her bound hands pressed against her belly. Tower turned to her, his breath like steam, his fists still curled. Then a voice came soft behind them. Oh, Lord, it was Araminta, his mother. Earlier in the evening, Charlotte saw Skylar pacing the floor of the parlor. He drank the last of his imported scotch. Then he grabbed his whip and headed for the quarters. She went to Araminta's cabin to warn her. Araminta grabbed her shawl, then she followed. Araminta stood in the broken doorway, frozen in shock and fear. She had 3 dresses. A black one for serving fancy dinners, 1 dress for day work, and 1 night dress for sleeping. She washed the latter 2 dresses twice a week with water she brought from the house. Each dress dried while she wore the other. Charlotte's shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her dark hair had a touch of wave she inherited from her father and a touch of gray. It was the evidence of a life squandered by hard work and frequent childbearing. Her first child came at 14, her last at 48. Araminta's eyes went to her son. Tower was her only son left. The others were gone, sold off one by one after the Fugitive Slave Act passed. Old man Skylar said it was just business, but she knew it was punishment. Her older sons, like Tower, were large and defiant. Araminta stepped into the cabin and whispered, "You must go." Tower looked to her, still breathing hard. Tears formed in his eyes. "They were all in peril, Mama," he replied with tears in his eyes. "Go now," she said. "No use arguing. If he is dead, they will kill you. If he is alive, they will do worse." Her hands trembled as she clutched the shawl mindfully. It was a mild evening, but the shawl had been her mother's, and it gave her a sense of security. She turned and ran back to her cabin, and came back with a jacket, trousers, a soft-brimmed hat, and a pair of boots that had once belonged to her youngest son, who was sold away in the previous spring. Her youngest, Spinner, had been her change-of-life baby. He was never right in the head, but he was harmless. He was not much use to Skylar, who claimed he was another mouth to feed with no benefit. Victoria then stripped off her dress and pulled on the trousers and shirt. The fabric was rough, unlike the frocks she normally wore, but it freed her limbs. The boots were a bit too big for Victoria, but she laced them up anyway. She tied her curly hair, the inheritance from her father, beneath the hat. Araminta spotted a baby bump in the making while Victoria was dressing. She smiled at her son. This would be the only grandchild that she knew of. They gathered hardtack, dried cornmeal, a few chunks of salt pork wrapped in cloth, with a small tin of lard. Araminta dug into the bottom of the master's cabinet and brought out a pewter cup and his whiskey. They had no water, but it was something. The small group worked quickly. Then Araminta turned to the block candle on the table. She gathered up the flint and blew out the light. It was store-bought. Most slaves never had such luxuries. She stowed it in the bag on top of the food along with the flint. Tower dragged Skylar's limp body out of the cabin. He pulled him over his shoulders and carried him like a sack of feed through the trees. At the edge of the shallow creek, he dropped him, face down in the water. If he wasn't dead, he soon would be. The current was slow, the water cold. "Let the earth have him," Tower muttered. But then Charlotte called out, "Wait." She came up behind them with a folded bundle of papers, crinkled, stained, but sealed with the master's mark. She'd snatched them from his office months ago and stashed them under the hearthstone in the big house kitchen. They were manumission forms. It was power set in ink and parchment. She had printed their names on them in preparation for this day. She knew Tower would take his wife, but she never anticipated that Lil Skylar would be killed. Araminta also carried a pouch of crushed pepper, and with swift, practiced hands, she knelt and rubbed it on their boots and ankles. She stuffed the rest in Victoria's pockets. Dogs won't track you long with this. Just enough for one day, though. One day's all we need, Tower said. Araminta looked at him, her son, a mountain of a man in rags, and Victoria, trembling but standing. Her hand went to Victoria's stomach. "Keep that baby alive," she said. She turned and walked away, never looking back. The next morning, Clara found a small tea cake sitting outside her door wrapped in a napkin from the main house. She looked around the quarters to see if anyone had noticed it. Surmising it was a gift from Skylar as a reward for her loyalty, she took a bite. She scrunched her face in response to the alkaloid taste that followed the sweet, powdered sugar on top. Then she took another bite and savored the sweetness again. Slaves had no access to sugar. They were lucky if they got a taste of honeycomb when it was harvested. Sometimes Charlotte would scrape the leavings from the buckets and share it with folks in the quarters. Suddenly, Clara was overtaken with an insatiable thirst. She hurried down to the creek to get a drink of water. Her face was partially submerged as she lapped at the water when she heard a shriek from one of the children who was fetching water from the creek. Clara looked up to see the body of Skylar laying not 3 feet away. Her only response was to move downstream to drink some more. She could not control her thirst. A few minutes later, the overseer followed the child to the creek. He was followed by Schuler's wife, who hid her smirk behind a daintily embroidered handkerchief. Gone was the oppressive and perverse husband who had married Mary for her fortune and family connections. The joke was on him. Her father had married Mary to Skylar for his fortune. In the end, neither party had any fortune to speak of. All Skylar had was the farm worked by 30 older slaves and a few rented from other faltering plantation. He had sold off most of the land first, and the younger slaves to stay afloat as the war raged, but his fortune and the farm continued to sink as the war progressed. Lil Skylar felt it was as though he was cursed. Araminta watches Clara, who had betrayed Victoria, was taken away, her hands tied behind her back. Clara would be blamed. A house napkin was found in her cabin. That was evidence enough for Mary. She would see that Clara paid with her life, for appearance sake. Then she would marry the man she loved and lost when her father forced her to marry Foster Skylar. The woods were thick with mist and silence, broken only by the soft slap of Tower's boots and Victoria's shallow breath. Each footfall landed softer than the last. They had learned the sound of silence when it meant safety and when it meant the world was holding its breath. Now it was the latter. The only sounds were the distant chorus of insects and the occasional owl, reminding them the night still had ears. Their boots, rubbed in Araminta's crushed pepper, had kept the hounds from finding them for hours. But the pepper essence would be gone soon, and Tower knew it. He hadn't spoken since they left the creek where he laid Skylar down like trash. They hadn't eaten. Their mouths were dry, but they didn't stop. Tower led Victoria over a rise and down into a hollow, using the moonlight to pick out the pathless way, always guiding north and west toward the river. "Your feet holdin' up?" he finally asked, his voice like gravel in water. "Feet bleedin', maybe," she said. "But I'm still movin'." He didn't smile, but he nodded once in acknowledgement, and they pressed on. Behind them, somewhere deep in the woods, a dog barked once. The sound was distant, muted by trees and wind. It was enough warning. They picked up speed, moving between oak trunks and brush, hands slapping brambles aside, clothes catching on deadwood and pine sap. Victoria's thighs burned, and her back was tight from the fall earlier, but she didn't complain. The moon began to fade, not into clouds, but into morning. Dawn came slow, like a breath being held. Then the trees changed. They saw willow, cottonwood, and tall wet grass. And the air? It was wet. The Red River was close. They reached a clearing just as the golden hour emerged. Victoria saw it first, a stretch of water, maybe 50 yards across, quiet and still in the early light. Thick mist rolled just above it. The river was wide but not deep here, choked at the edges by mud, cattails, and the slick green shine of algae. "No raft?" she asked. Tower shook his head. We wade. They stepped carefully through the marshy edge, the mud sucking at their boots. Victoria's legs felt like clay. Her arms ached. Her mouth was like a desert. Tower tested the water first. It reached his knees, then thighs, then his waist. He offered his arms. She didn't argue. She pressed into his back, this time for safety. She could not swim. He lifted her carefully with good arm and waded in, one step at a time, the current curling around them like a cold ribbon. Halfway through, the river opened wide. They paused. He only had one good arm. She wrapped her arms around him as he paddled with both arms. The scab on the injured arm broke open, but he pushed on until he felt the marshy ground beneath his feet. Behind them, on the shore, the forest was quiet. But they both looked back. A lone collie stood at the edge of the trees. It didn't bark, just watched. Its shape still in shadow. Tower relaxed a little. It was a herding dog, not a hound. "You see it?" she whispered. "I see it." Tower didn't hurry. He moved forward slow and steady, never letting her slip, never showing fear. Not to her. They reached the opposite bank as the first birds began to sing. Tower helped her out of the water, boots dripping, and they stepped into a new set of woods. Victoria collapsed against a tree and closed her eyes. Not from panic, just the weight of it all finally pressing down on her mind. Her husband had probably killed the slave master. The implications for everyone on the farm were dire. Tower stood watch a few feet away, hand on the old pewter cup that hung from a rope around his waist used to hold up his pants. No shots. No men. No voices. Just breath, trees, and the soft lap of river water behind them. They had crossed. Not into freedom, but out of Red River County. Indian territory was close, but it had its own perils. Miles away, back on the farm, a white hound turned its head and whined. It could not find the trail. Simpson spat and kicked at the ground, but the dog would not move. They had vanished like ghosts. It was no matter to him. Simpson was never a fan of Lil Schuyler, and he was glad to see him gone. He was not surprised that Mrs. Schuyler had dispatched a young hand to retrieve her father and another man. Simpson guessed that this young man would soon be the new master. Lil Schuyler was dead. The murderer, Clara, was caught at the scene of the crime. Mrs. Schuyler was pleased to see that her rival, Victoria, was gone. Simpson tied the dog up in the kennel and went back to bed. It would be a day off for everyone. Charlotte went to the big house to prepare lunch for the guests. There would be plenty of changes coming to the farm. She hoped this would stop the sale of people and land. After the meal was prepared, she placed a tin containing a white powder on the top shelf of the cupboard. Slaves like Clara held no allegiance to anyone. They were dangerous. After finding her near the body of Schuyler, no one would believe a word she said. Araminta was sad to see her son and his wife depart in such desperate circumstances, but she prayed that her grandchild would be born free. The morning light was creeping through the trees. They had reached the border of Indian Territory, unfamiliar woods, Chickasaw Territory, one of the 5 civilized tribes recognized by the United States government. The woods had changed. The trees here were spaced farther apart, and the ground was drier, packed hard with sun-bleached grass and stones. The songs of the birds were different, sharp, short, and full of warnings. Tower walked ahead, Victoria behind him, one arm across her stomach, the other clutching her side where she was kicked. Her face was tight with pain, though she tried to hide it. Her lips were cracked. Her breath came shallow. He hadn't said anything, but he'd noticed the faint spotting of blood on her pant leg earlier. She needed to stop. But they were not safe. He had dealt with Chickasaw before at trading posts in Texas. They were traders, mostly, passing through when the sun was high and the rifles were quiet. But that was with peace between them and men looking to trade meat and hides for blades or powder. A band of warriors was another matter. Tower slowed his steps. He raised his hand for silence. Victoria paused behind him. A wind passed. Then, snap. The sound of a broken twig. He knew it was no bird. Tower's eyes scanned the shadows between the mesquites and oaks. He saw no one, but someone saw him. "Come on," he whispered, barely audible. "We need to move." He grabbed Victoria's hand, rough and trembling. She tried to smile at him. "I'm all right," she lied. He didn't believe her. Her body leaned into his without meaning to. His heart pounded. Noon was approaching fast. The forest ahead looked the same in every direction. No trails. No markers. No mercy. Then he saw something, a rise of stones beneath a corpse of cedar. If they could just get there, just rest and hide until nightfall. He turned back toward Victoria and light exploded in his skull. Something struck him from behind. Heavy. Silent. The last thing he saw in Victoria's face was a flash of fear, her mouth opening in a scream. Then nothing. He woke to heat. The dry, smothering heat of midday sun on bare skin. His hands were bound behind his back, tight. Rough rope cut into his wrists. He was lying on the ground, the world spinning. His head throbbed. A sticky wetness matted his hair. When he blinked, dust filled his eyes. He tried to lift himself, but groaned and fell flat again. Somewhere nearby, a woman coughed. It was Victoria. He turned his head. She was still clothed, still conscious, but her eyes were wide, and her breath came in shallow pulls. She was kneeling, hands tied in front of her, her hat gone. Her curls clung to her brow. She saw him stir, and her shoulders sagged. "Tower," she whispered. A voice spoke from behind him. Calm. Low. He's awake. Tower squinted against the sun. Figures stepped into view. Men. On horseback. Painted faces. Long black hair. Guns and bows at their sides. One man dismounted. Young, sharp-eyed, and shirtless, but for a bone-and-leather vest. He approached Tower and crouched beside him. He said something in Chickasaw, then switched to English. "You not dead? Good. We won't kill yet." Tower's jaw clenched. He didn't speak. "You are in our land," the man said, rising. "We decide what happened next." He walked to Victoria, who flinched but did not cower. The man looked at her, then at her belly. He narrowed his eyes, then turned and shouted something to the others. They spoke back quick, heated. Tower didn't know what it meant, but whatever it was, his fate was no longer his own. The Chickasaw warriors spoke in a tongue neither Tower nor Victoria understood, but they didn't need translation. The circling, the tightening grips on weapons, the way they looked at Victoria's belly, it all said enough. Tower was still on his knees, wrists bound behind him, head heavy from blood loss. The heat cooked his skin. But when he heard Victoria gasp, not in pain, but in dread, something ancient moved in him. He twisted his hands. The rope cut deeper, but he didn't stop. The lead warrior gave a quiet command. 3 men stepped forward. Tower looked up at them through a veil of sweat and dust. Then snap, the cord broke. He didn't think. He stood, legs trembling but solid beneath him, and he swung. His first punch landed square on the jaw of the nearest warrior, a crack of knuckle on bone that sent the man spinning to the dirt. The second came in fast with a club. Tower ducked low, wrapped his arms around the man's waist, and drove his shoulder into his gut. The man hit the ground wheezing, the wind knocked clean from his lungs. Tower turned just in time to hear Victoria scream. A fourth warrior, unseen till now, had come from behind and pressed a blade to her stomach, the sharp edge trembling just above the cloth stretched over their unborn child. "No!" Tower roared. He raised his hands. "Don't!" Victoria shouted. The third brave, the one Tower had missed, took his chance. The blade slid deep under Tower's ribs, just left of center. It wasn't a scream that came out of Tower's mouth. It was more like a breath ripped from the inside of his chest. He staggered back, blood already pouring through his fingers. Victoria shouted his name. The warrior with the knife at her belly hesitated. Tower dropped to one knee, but his eyes never left her. He forced himself up again. His legs were trembling now, a red stain blooming across his shirt. He took a step forward. "Let her go," he said. "Let her go. No threats. No rage. Just truth. She not part of this." nor is the child. The fourth warrior, young, with a jagged scar across his brow, looked into Tower's eyes. Something in that gaze made him pause. It wasn't fear. It was offering. The brave lowered his blade. Tower crumpled to his knees. Victoria broke free and ran to him, arms under his shoulders, crying now, not because she was afraid, but because she had never seen him fall. His blood covered her hands. He looked up at her. "You, strong now," he whispered. "Don't say goodbye," she begged, rocking him gently. "Please don't." He closed his eyes. The warrior with the scar knelt beside them, speaking fast to the others in Chickasaw. The one who had stabbed Tower was pulled away. There was no triumph in the circle now, only respect. Or maybe regret. The smoke still lived in Victoria's hair at the Chickasaw camp. Victoria stirred beneath a buffalo hide that smelled of dried blood and wild herbs. Her throat was dry, her limbs stiff. She blinked slowly, not sure what had woken her, the quiet, maybe. Or the weight of the world pressing back down onto her chest. Tower was gone. Not taken. Not sold. Not vanished in the night. He was stabbed in front of her. The sky was black, the fire was red, and the smell was sickening. The smell was worse than death. Victoria stood frozen, just beyond the ring of painted warriors. Tower's body had been dumped like raw meat at the foot of a wooden stake. He wasn't bound. He wasn't buried. He was offering to fire. It was their way to dispose of enemies. The flames licked up his pants leg first, then his shirt, and then his hair began to smoke. Victoria did not scream. She couldn't. Her throat closed like a fist. Above the fire, tied to the stake, another man was bound. He was Comanche, lean, older, half-starved, and far from home. Scorched pants. His face streaked with ash and blood. The Chickasaw had bound him to the stake. His was not a funeral, it was an execution. They wanted him to smell the fire, to hear it as it approached his flesh. She did not know his name, but he watched her. Tower moaned. Victoria shook her head in disbelief. He was not dead, but close. He moved and he moaned, soft and broken. And then he spoke, Victoria. He spoke her name through fire and intense pain. Victoria dropped to her knees. She clutched her belly, ball rising fast. The heat clawed at her cheeks, her skin blistering even from yards away. The smell clawed its way into her lungs. She turned and vomited into the dust. A hand grabbed her arm roughly. A Chickasaw woman, face unreadable, dragged her away from the circle and shoved her toward a low-slung hide tent. Victoria stumbled inside. The air was thick, but the fire's roar dimmed. "Tower," she screamed. She dropped to her knees in the dark, panting. Then she heard his voice again. It was louder this time, Victoria. It was his last breath. It cut her in half. She clawed at the tent wall and found a slit near the bottom seam, torn loose from an old stitch. With shaking hands, she widened it. Her belly pressed flat to the earth. She slid through, dust covering her skin, sweat turning to mud on her back. She crawled toward the campfire for cooking. A few burning sticks sat like bones at its center. She grabbed one. Then another. She rose, scanned the camp. A pile of dried grass sat near a rack of animal skins. Clutching her bag, she moved like her limbs weren't hers. Her mind gone somewhere past grief, past rage. She lit the grass using the stick and the whiskey from the flask Skylar kept at the blue cabin. He was long dead by now. He would not miss it. She shoved it into the seam of the nearest tent and lit it. Then she poured a little whiskey on the head. The flames caught fast. The dry hide and grass turning bright as torchlight. She moved like a shadow, igniting tent after tent, her hand trembling with pain and purpose. She lit 12 in all. Screams began, from women and children. Smoke filled the air. Men ran for water from the creek. It was madness. She moved through the chaos, the firelight turning her skin gold and red. Then she stopped at Tower's body, what remained. The fire had done its work. His face was unrecognizable, but in his hand he still clenched in burned fingers was a coin. The coin he carried since Texas. A single silver dollar, smoothed by years of worry. He had once told her, if I got this, I got a future. She took it and held it to her chest. Their child would have a future. Above her, the Comanche man still tied at the stake, but he was alive. The flames had not yet climbed the pole, but they had scorched his leather chaps. He stared down at her, silent, with gritted teeth. She looked up at him, her skin blackened by smoke and tears. And then she did what no one else would do. She stood up and pulled the knife from a dropped scabbard on the ground and cut his bonds. He dropped like a sack of corn. He didn't speak. He didn't thank her. He ran into the smoke, into the trees, limping, half-naked. He did not look back. She stood alone. And then the Chickasaw warriors saw her. Victoria had single-handedly destroyed their camp. It was justice. They had destroyed her future. 4 of them. So covered, eyes full of blood and disbelief. They drew knives and came forward. She did not run. She stood in front of Tower's ruined body, the coin in one hand, the other clutching the bag Araminta had packed. And then hooves approached. A thunder of them. A horse burst through the smoke, its rider low in the saddle, body gleaming with sweat and soot. It was the Comanche who was called Black Smoke. It was a fitting name. He rode straight through the Chickasaw line, grabbed Victoria by the waist, and yanked her up behind him. She gasped. Victoria had never ridden, but she held tight to his chest. The Chickasaw braves shouted, turning, running to their corral. But their horses were scattered, panicked by fire and screams. Black Smoke turned his mount west and galloped through the blaze. Victoria pressed against him like she was carved from stone. The camp behind them burned. The Chickasaw would follow. But for tonight they were safe. The horse galloped for hours. Victoria held fast to Black Smoke's waist, her arms aching, her cheek pressed against his shoulder as the wind tore her hair loose behind her. The plains gave way to foothills. The grass thinned. The air dried. The earth here was red, dry, veined with thornbush and scattered stone. Tower had once spoken of the West like it was myth, like it was where the sun went to die. But the sun still climbed above them, cruel and bright, watching without pity. Victoria's thighs were raw from the ride. Her face burned. But she said nothing. She couldn't. Her mouth tasted of ash, her ears still held the last sound Tower made. They passed no towns. No markers. Just broken sky. By the time the horse began to slow, Victoria felt nearly weightless. The baby in her belly kicked once. It was weak, like a match spark in the dark. She smiled. He was still alive. She blinked and realized they were entering a clearing in the hills where 6 small domed shelters stood, framed by rock and dry branches. A skin flap lifted. An old man stepped forward. His eyes went to Black Smoke first, and then to her. He did not speak, but his arms went wide. Black Smoke dismounted and was embraced, their foreheads pressed together. No ceremony, just kinship. The old man's voice shook. He said something fast in Comanche words Victoria could not understand, but she saw the meaning in his face. Where have you been? Black Smoke answered just as fast, his words tumbling over each other, glancing up at the sky like the sun itself would punish delay. Then he stepped away and gathered what little lay nearby: a bag of dried meat, water skins, 2 cloaks, a pouch of herbs. He moved with purpose. The old man followed, speaking still. But his eyes kept returning to Victoria. Not unkind. Just confused. She didn't know whether to climb down or stay on the horse. Black Smoke saw her hesitation. He walked back, took the reins, and offered his hand. Come. She slid down, legs stiff. The old man approached her slowly. His face was lined and sun-cut, and his eyes were dark with questions. He said something. She didn't know the words, but she could guess. She was too dark. Her hair was too curly. Her belly marked her as carrying another man's child. She stood tall, though her back screamed. She met his eyes and didn't blink. Black Smoke said something sharp in Comanche. His father flinched, then nodded. There was no welcome, only a slow step backward. Black Smoke handed her a water skin and a blanket. We travel more, he said. I figured, Victoria said, flat. He touched her shoulder lightly. I give what I can. She nodded. It was enough. He would take her to a safer place, but he would not stay with her. It did not matter. He was a stranger. All that bound them was the horror of Tower's charred remains. He looked to the sun again. It was dropping now, heat leaving the ground like breath. He lifted the bundle of food, tied it behind the saddle, and held the reins tight. Then he mounted, held his hand out again. Victoria stepped forward and let herself be lifted back into the saddle. They rode on west, past blood, past fire, and past the faces that would never accept them. But not all journeys are made for welcome. Some are for survival. A week's journey across blood-washed soil, between memory and mountain, has brought Victoria and Black Smoke to the edge of something new, not home, but haven. And though the land still speaks with scars, here, for the first time, there are others like her. It was 1 week after the burning of the Chickasaw camp. They had reached a settlement near Cimarron, in northern Arizona territory. The other half of the Comanche tribe had moved farther west after the last Chickasaw raid. White men had turned the red man against each other to clear a path for their cities and towns. They were scattered and struggling for survival as the white march westward continued. What had been Mexico a little more than a decade earlier was now part of the U.S. Mexicans, Comanche, and Apache found themselves foreigners in their own land. Northern Arizona was nothing like any land Victoria had seen. Black Smoke had only found the way because of the Comanche markings they had encountered along the way. The new settlement was near a white town called Cimarron. Ironically, it was located near another Red River. But this one was not like Victoria's Red River. It was tucked into a mountain. The people at the settlement were from many tribes. Several blacks lived among the people. Black Smoke looked at Victoria. She nodded, and he helped her off the horse. He then untied the pack that hung on either side of the horse. The wind smelled different here. It was dry. It wasn't heavy like Texas wind, thick with heat, humidity, and rot. Here it was dry, hot with a bite of stone and pine and old fire in it. The sun didn't press down, it lingered, sharp-edged and silver like a knife gliding above the red-topped peaks. Cimarron. Black Smoke had spoken the name under his breath when they crested the ridge. Victoria hadn't seen it yet, just the sliver of smoke and the glint of canvas roofs far below. But the sound of it stuck in her chest. The last river she crossed had taken a lot out of her. This one promised nothing. But it didn't take. They followed a narrow trail along a rock shelf, the horse stepping careful and slow. The marks carved into the stone, small symbols, a line of dots. A slashed square were the only reason Black Smoke had found the trail at all. Without them, they'd have passed the place completely. Comanche? Victoria asked softly. He shook his head. Not just. Many people. Runners. Fighters. Those not wanted anywhere else. Like me. He didn't correct her. They reached a plateau sloping toward a deep-cut valley. Below, a patchwork of shelters, huts, and fire pits wove around the hills like a sleeping animal. Smoke rose thin from cook fires. Children ran between poles. A stream, barely wide enough to call a river, split the camp in two. Red water reflected a purple sky. Black Smoke stopped the horse at the edge of the ridge. Victoria shifted her weight, her back ached from the ride, and her legs trembled slightly when she dismounted. Black Smoke held her steady, his hand strong on her waist. She looked down at the settlement. Her eyes caught on a small circle of people near the water, washing clothes. 2 of them were black. A man and a woman. Not slaves. Not servants. Just part of the camp. It took her a moment to understand what that meant. She turned to Black Smoke. He studied her. Waited. She nodded. He helped her down and untied the packs from the horse, lowering them carefully onto a flat stone. The dried meat, cornmeal, clay-stoppered jars of water and lard, the pouch of herbs they'd carried from his father's camp. He unstrapped the horse's bridle and let it drink from the edge of the trail. "Where are we?" she asked. He looked out over the valley. Not Comanche. Not Chickasaw. Not white man's land. Not yet. She sat on a stone, pulled her cloak around her shoulders, and looked out over the roofs of people who might, or might not, want her among them. The child shifted inside her. Alive. "I ain't afraid," she said, voice low. Black Smoke nodded once, as if to say, "You've already proved that." 6 months later, Victoria cried out while they lay next to each other. Black Smoke sat up and placed his hand on her ever-hardening belly. He got up and dressed. He left their tent and returned several minutes with a healer. The only sounds were the distant chorus of insects and the occasional owl, reminding them the night still had ears. She cried out, and the sound shook the canvas of their shelter. Victoria lay curled on her side, sweat soaking through her shift, her knees pulled toward her chest. Her breath came ragged, and her hands clutched the hide blanket beneath her as if it could hold the pain back. Beside her, Black Smoke woke instantly. He turned and pressed his palm to the curve of her belly, now stretched tight and hard beneath her skin. Her body had grown full with the child, her face leaner, but her eyes sharper, more haunted, more certain. She had not cried for Tower in months, not aloud. But tonight, she cried for this. "It's starting," she whispered through gritted teeth. Black Smoke was already rising, pulling on his trousers, slipping his arms into his buckskin coat, tying his hair back. He did not panic. He had seen birth before once. His wife, years ago. The woman lost in the Comanche raid. That child had been a son. He had died screaming. He shoved the thought away. The air outside was cool and silent. Stars scattered thick above the mountains. A coyote called somewhere on the far slope. Black Smoke walked fast between the shelters, toward the round tent at the far edge of camp where Natse, the old healer woman, kept her fire burning every night. She had known the ways of both Comanche medicine and what the Plains tribes called gut wisdom. She had seen women die, and she had kept others alive long enough to hold their children once. He stopped at her flap. "Victoria," he said. That was all. Natse was already awake. Victoria clenched her jaw, trying not to scream again. Her breath came shallow, like her ribs were tied with rope. The pain wasn't sharp yet, but deep, like something rising from her bones to tear itself free. The child kicked hard. Then her belly tightened again, and she moaned, unable to hold it back. The flap opened. Black Smoke stepped inside, followed by Natse, small and wiry, her face like a dried riverbed, her braids streaked with gray. "Lie back," she said, in soft English, her accent thick with old-world edges. "This one's ready." "You strong?" Victoria tried to answer. Couldn't. "Good," Natse muttered. "Don't need words. Just breathe." Black Smoke knelt beside her. His hand found hers. She gripped it like iron. "I'm here," he said. The fire in the center of the tent crackled quietly as Natse unwrapped her bundled dried herbs, bone needle, 2 strips of clean linen, and a small knife. "First pain means the sun will rise with this one," she said. "We work until it comes." Victoria nodded. Then the next wave hit, and the tent filled with her voice. Several hours later, she had finished her labor. Black Smoke was allowed to enter. A child was handed to him. He accepted it as though it were his own. He looked down at the reddish face of the baby boy. He looked nothing like Victoria's husband. His skin was reddish-brown, and his hair was straight like black smoke. It was as though the gods had favored him with his own son again. The one who was killed in the Chickasaw raid. "I will stay," he said. Black Smoke looked at his partner in life. She sobbed and held herself as the last part of her husband's memory slipped away. The child she had carried and Tower fought to protect was not his, but Skylar's. She would look into the face of her attacker for the rest of her life. "How do you call him?" the healer asked. "We will call him Tower," Black Smoke said. "No," Victoria said. "He shall be known as Little Fire, for it was fired that bought us our freedom," Victoria said. Black Smoke smiled for the first time since they met. He recalled how she fearlessly braved flame and Chickasaw warriors to free him from the stake. She had sacrificed her dying husband to set him free. He had sacrificed his family. Now they were a new family and he had a son. 5 years later, the war had ended a year prior. Black Smoke left Victoria's side only once. He returned on horseback 2 weeks later, followed by Spinner driving a wagon. Sitting beside him was Charlotte and Araminta. His father followed the wagon on horseback. Black Smoke looked at their 3 sons while he worked. The forge clanged like thunder from the back shed. Black Smoke stood over the anvil, bare-chested in the morning sun, one hand wrapped in thick hide, the other gripping long iron tongs. He pulled the blade from the coals, its orange-red glow reflecting in his dark eyes, and slammed it to the steel block. Once, twice, 3 times. Not a sword this time, a short blade. Simple, for skinning. But he took the same care with it as with the blades mounted in their house. Inside, Victoria laughed inside as her grandmother recounted stories of the past, the sound of her joy drifting through the open window. The boys were up early again, ready to learn to be men. Black Smoke set the blade down and turned toward the door, wiping his brow. 3 figures ran past the edge of the forge, his sons, chasing each other through the red dirt road. The oldest, Little Fire, carried a stick bow on his back and shouted commands in both English and Comanche. He had Black Smoke's temperament and his mother's stare. Already sharp. Already watching. The second, Red Smoke, was lean and clever. Quiet but fast. His laughter was rare, but when it came, it rang like a drum. And the last, just 3 years old, almost as tall as Red Smoke, with darker skin almost the color of Victoria's, ran behind them barefoot, long jet black hair trailing behind him, arms outstretched. His name was Tower. Black Smoke had waited. He had respected her choice the first time when she named their first son Little Fire, in honor of the night that they birthed their new life. Victoria had held that baby with both love and sorrow, her body shaking as she whispered, "It was fire that freed us. It took my husband, but it gave us back the sky." And the child had looked nothing like Tower. He had Skylar's blood but none of his soul. Victoria never spoke of it again. But when their third son was born, tall, dark as a shadow, with deep eyes that saw everything, it was Black Smoke who named him. "He is Tower," he had said. "Born again." Victoria had nodded and wept, not from pain, but from peace. The town of Pueblo was not much. A stretch of dirt road, 2 feed stores, a chapel, a schoolhouse, and scattered homes. But it was theirs. Victoria's dressmaking business had taken root quickly. She worked quietly in the front room, the walls lined with bolts of fabric and tiny sketches pinned with bone needles. Her customers came from the town and beyond, farmers' wives, even a banker's daughter from Santa Fe. She never spoke of Texas, but her hands still stitched with the same speed she had used to light the Chickasaw tents. Black Smoke's forge sat behind the house, a squared shed of stone and timber. His blades hung on every wall, some decorative, others functional, all sharp. People came from miles to buy his steel. But he refused to sell swords to soldiers. He made that rule on his first day in Pueblo. And every afternoon, when the boys returned from the woods or the creek, he taught them archery, tracking, shooting. Little Fire could hit a moving rabbit at 30 paces. Red Smoke could disappear in trees before his name was called. Tower, nearly 4, could already draw his older brother's bow halfway. Black Smoke watched them now, running through dust and sun. He folded his arms and smiled. Inside the house, Victoria stood at the doorway, hand on her hip, belly dusted with flour. Her hair was pinned back, and her eyes still burned. She watched them all, fingers curled lightly around the silver coin she still kept in her apron pocket. It was the last thing Tower ever gave her. She had let go of what they had, but she would never forget him. He forged a path to freedom, and Black Smoke brought her the rest of the way. Behind her, one of Black Smoke's swords caught the morning light on the wall. Its edge gleamed like a promise. Their sons would never be taken. Thanks for stopping by. Check out our Hampton Bay book series by Denise Nichols on Amazon and Barnes & Nobles.